Is The Last of Us adaptation any good? Episode 2. I like this pattern. We'll see if it continues. But the pre-credit scene is like a background scene. It goes into the past. It doesn't go as far into the past as the first episode, but it does go show some of the origins of the plague or whatever the cordyceps infection is in another country. I think this was in India, if I remember correctly. That ends up being set up for one of the main points of this episode, which is also one of the main changes. From there in the episode, we're talking in a scene, with Ellie and Joel and Tess. And this is a scene that doesn't happen really in the game, somewhat, but not this exact scene. They chose to show Joel's skepticism about her being infected or not, and being much more ready to just take Ellie out, showing Tess's more potential hopefulness, or something maybe getting turned back on inside her brain, some part of her humanity or her ability to hope. And I like the scene. It's not from the game, but it doesn't feel out of place. And even though Joel in the game isn't, at least initially, nearly as like he's ready to shoot her. You know, I don't remember that really being a thing in the game, at least not for very long past the scene where they find out she's infected. Right. So that's a change, but it makes sense to me. I think the character, Joel's character, it would make sense. It makes maybe more sense that he's a little bit more concerned about it. So it works. And then you get to contrast that with Tess, who's believing it more readily. And I did recently just play through this section of the game, and it plays out slightly differently, but the basic idea is the same. They go try one route, or really you end up having to go through one area. You encounter the infected in one way, and then you go through a second area, which is the same area in both games. You end up going through a museum. And up until that point where they cross over the rooftops, it's pretty faithful. Some of the conversations are the same. There's stuff they took out in the show that's in the game that's mostly a gameplay segment. It's actually like one of the most, for me, the gameplay segment they skipped in this in the show, which was a clicker segment that they didn't have. They had clickers, but they have the museum clickers, not, I don't know if it was an office building or something. The first time you have to deal with clickers in the game is a little different. But in the show, during this section, one of the main changes becomes more apparent, and they talk about it. They talk about the cordyceps. They talk about them being able to sense your presence through them, because there's like an interconnected network, and they show these tendrils even in that opening scene. And I've seen it in maybe some other scene or some promotional material, the tendrils coming out of the mouth. That aspect is new to the show, but I think it's visually cool, and it makes a lot of sense when you're talking about like fungus and how that can work and how it can be a large interconnected network. I mean, I think there's I don't know if it's a forest or something where there's just one giant fungus all interconnected. I remember hearing about that. So they're kind of playing into that as a concept, which is pretty freaky. And even though it's different from the game, when I first heard they weren't really using spores, because spores is how they do this in the game, I was worried maybe they weren't even doing like a fungal infection anymore. But I wasn't really paying that close of attention, and I'm so used to things being dramatically changed lately that it just seemed like that's possible. But no, they didn't. They actually made this, I think, more realistic. The spore thing works as a gameplay mechanic, kind of, but I like this cordyceps network thread. I forget the name for the actual threads, but I like that better, actually. I think it's actually an improvement, personally. So it just makes more sense to me. I'm not sure that it would have worked as well in a game. It's certainly not the way the game's currently designed. I'm sure you could have found a way, but they just didn't think to go that way, or they went the way they did. I like that change. That change comes into play a little later. It actually helps explain how they get chased down by zombies better than when it happens in the game. You do end up in the game going through a museum, having a big fight that's more than just clickers. And even though you don't see it happen, Tess does get bitten, and they have their moment on the roof, which that scene, there's some direct dialogue, and then the view, can't deny the view line is in there. And so it's like they're hitting like the really important points, and then they're adapting some of the other stuff. And the adaptations in this case so far are improvements. So I don't know if this is going to keep up, but it gives me a little bit more hope still for the second game, because the more I think about it, I did enjoy playing the second game, but the storytelling in it is very heavy-handed, and the way they executed on some of the big moments was dismissive in a way, or just it just wasn't that done that elegantly. And I think it was done intentionally to be that brutal, but I just think there's a better way to do it. And the way the writing is on the show so far, I feel like they might find a better way, which will be very interesting to see. They could improve the story of the second game, even if they don't change much about it, the way this is going for the first game, because I was not expecting to be preferring the changes, but so far I'm pretty much especially the cordyceps details. And the next section of the episode and the game is approaching the capital. It ends up being mostly the same. The big difference being they have the infected show up to chase them away, and Tess sacrifices herself to give them time to get away. And it's the infected in the show, and then in the game it's actually the military, or whatever the military forces from the city, or the QZ, or whatever, the quarantine zone, I guess. This change, I understand why they have this, because in the game, the next section of the game, you're actually fighting through the military, and so you get your combat section or whatever, at least that first part of it. We'll see in the next episode if they go down this road at all. But basically, in the game, they have to fight through the military a little bit, and then they have to escape through a watery area, which Ellie not swimming comes into play even more so there in the game. It came into play in the show, so that's still a thing. So I'm guessing that's still coming, and we're probably going to get the swimming lesson scene eventually too. I know they end up going to Lincoln, and it looks like that's where the show's going to from the preview. So I'm looking forward to seeing how this all continues. I still prefer, I think I'm just used to it, Ellie and Joel in the game, like playing the game, they feel, when I'm looking at them, more like Ellie and Joel to me than the show. But the show is like rapidly, I'm starting to prefer the show in other ways, and I feel like it's gonna start overtaking at some point, unless they start screwing up, which is possible. But I think they figured out, at least this first season, what they're doing. Anyway, those are my thoughts for now. See you next week in episode 3. So far, the adaptation is still good. We'll see if that continues.